Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience. Good afternoon. Excellencies, respected leaders, guests, allies, all protocols observed. It's truly an honor to be able to welcome you on behalf of Ford Foundation and Oxfam to this convening titled Multilateralism in an Era of Global Oligarchy. My name is Nabil. I'm Oxfam America's Director of Economic and Racial Justice. We're here together in New York and also in solidarity with people who are not. People with whom Oxfam, like so many of you, stands with in countries, movements, communities across the globe. Those folks who wage fights and struggles, yes, but also those ordinary people weary of how inequality robs the promise of freedom from their children. As we watch powerful people gather not far from here, I can't help but think of a convening of leaders in 1955, as countries newly liberated from colonialism met in Bandung in Indonesia. President Sukarno, who gathered them, said, and I quote, "We're often told colonialism is dead. Let's not be deceived or even soothed by that. I say to you, colonialism is not yet dead. How can we say it's dead? So long as vast areas of Asia and Africa are unfree. And I beg of you, do not think of colonialism only in the classic form, which we of Indonesia, our brothers in different parts of Asia and Africa knew. Colonialism also has its modern dress in the form of economic control, intellectual control, actual physical control by a small but alien community within a nation." And he continues, and he ends this passage by saying, "Wherever, whenever, and however it appears, colonialism is an evil thing, one which must be eradicated from the earth." End quote. One way to think about today is our asking how far we've come from that moment almost 70 years ago. It's our asking how oligarchy in 2024 crushes that promise of freedom within countries, but also in how we solve global problems together, something that our new paper that we have here today tackles head on. And it's asking how we're going to, and we will, attain that promise of freedom. This is the latest of a series of convenings to disrupt post-neoliberal economic thinking. Here's how we'll run. First, I have the distinct privilege of welcoming 𝘂𝘭𝘰𝘣𝘭, who over the past 3 years has designed the Ford Foundation's program on global governance, which is supporting a rich array of organizations, thinkers, social movements, especially across the global south, to advance the struggles for a more equitable and just world order. And then it's over to the panel, which will run us through until 2:30 p.m. We're joined by His Excellency Ronald Lamola, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, a nation that stood brave for the global south and for all peoples, as we see on Gaza, as we saw through the pandemic. South Africa will also lead the G20 in 2025. Nanjala Nyabola, independent, pioneering writer, researcher, activist, who was also part of the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. Amitabh Bihar, the executive director of Oxfam International, someone who brings decades of experience in human rights to lead the 80-plus country Oxfam network. And the panel will be moderated by the Washington Post Karen Attiah, one of the nation's foremost voices on race, gender, human rights, and international affairs, and the Post's founding global opinions editor. And just, folks, as I share my excitement about this panel, I do tremble a little bit before all of you, because we don't take for granted the chance to welcome a room of leaders like this, of you, of activists, advocates, former heads of state and government, thinkers, straight up some of our heroes. We see you, we thank you. That's it from me. Have fun, everyone. Please join me in welcoming 𝘂𝘭𝘰𝘣𝘭 on the question of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nabil. Well, at the moment, I wish I hadn't edited my long remarks into such a short introduction. Good afternoon. I'm 𝘂𝘭𝘰𝘣𝘭. I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Global Governance Program here at the Ford Foundation, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our Center for Social Justice. I do not wish to delay handing over to Karen and our esteemed panelists, for whom we are so grateful and delighted that they have agreed to help us interrogate the state of the world at this moment during UNGA's high-level week by examining multilateralism in the era of global oligarchy. Our partners Oxfam have today released an important report on this very subject with this very title. In addition to what we are about to learn from our panelists and our speakers, please also read this report as soon as you have the opportunity. It is very important. For the past decade, since Darren Walker became president of the Ford Foundation, the foundation has shifted its focus, its mission, and indeed our grant-making in order to focus on disrupting the structural drivers of inequality. And make no mistake, we are living in a world that is an increasingly unequal world, a world of inequitable, unjust, and unrepresentative systems of global governance that have contributed directly to the origins of the very global problems that we seek to address through multilateralism. These systems favor a few at the expense of the many, particularly the countries and people of the global South, the global majority. Taken together, these systems of global governance constitute a kind of global apartheid, a system of global minority rule, where on the one hand, the flow of benefits and advantages are directed to the wealthier minority of countries and the wealthy elites who hold power within them. And on the other hand, the distribution of suffering and the flow of disadvantages has continued to compound exponentially the historic damage imposed upon the global South through centuries of slavery and colonialism, extraction and exploitation, and more recently through the integration of these global majority states following colonialism into a highly unequal system of global governance, the post-World War II order, without compensation, without reparations. Global apartheid, stated briefly, it's an international system of minority rule whose attributes include differential access to basic human rights, wealth, and power that are structured by race, gender, and geography, and also by structural racism and patriarchy that are embedded in global economic processes, political institutions, and cultural assumptions, and the international practice of double standards that assume inferior rights to be appropriate for certain others who are again defined by race, gender, and geography. Global apartheid, thus defined, we believe, is more than a metaphor. It clearly defines what is fundamentally unacceptable about the current global system. It strips it of the aura of inevitability, and it puts justice and democracy on the agenda as the requirements for its transformation. Apartheid may have been defeated in South Africa, and we celebrate that, but the struggle to defeat global apartheid continues. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Karen to lead our colleagues to the stage, and I believe Minister Lamola has now joined us. So could you all please come up on the stage, and I'll hand it off to you, Karen. Thank you so much.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Sort of. All right. Well, I wanted to start off by thanking Oxfam and the Ford Foundation for putting this event together and for inviting me and our distinguished guest and panelists to have this conversation, which I believe is going to be a really, I hope that we get at least 30, 45 minutes to at least push the envelope a little bit on these issues when it comes to, as was so, I think, profoundly stated, oligarchy and reframing and thinking of it in the framework of the rule of a minority against the global majority and apartheid. So without further ado, I will turn it to our panelists. If you want to briefly, perhaps I'll actually start with the Foreign Minister, actually, of South Africa. Again, thank you so much for being here today. And we'll just get right into it. Let's start off with South Africa. South Africa has obviously been an important leader in the world, particularly on these issues of justice, of freedom, of apartheid. And specifically, of course, what's been in the news is South Africa's role in pushing for justice when it comes to the case of Gaza and Israel at the International Criminal Court. Now, South Africa, you're about to lead the G20, which is a first for an African nation. So just to start off with, how do you see multilateralism? And for South Africa, is there a different kind of multilateralism that South Africa would be calling for in this moment?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. As you have already alluded to, that South Africa gained its freedom in 1994 from the yokes of apartheid and a moral system that we were held by the entire globe to fight against, various resolutions of the United Nations. And this year, South Africa celebrates 30 years of democracy. And we celebrate. So we also celebrated it in style. It was also a year of elections in South Africa this year. And for the first time, the governing party, the ANC, which I come from, did not get the 50% plus one as per the requirement of the South African Constitution to form a government on its own. So the ANC had to engage with all the parties in South Africa to form one government, and we now have 10 parties all collaborating and participating in a government of national unity. We did this in our belief in the interest of the people of South Africa because there are pressing challenges, unemployment, inequality, and poverty that we have to work on, to build on. And we are now building a movement around that to help us resolve these triple challenges. But we also have a moral responsibility to fight injustice anywhere in the world, as informed by our own constitution. And it is against that background that we felt it befitting when we condemned the actions of Hamas of October 7 when it happened. But we believe that the response by the state of Israel is excessively disproportionate to the situation, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the killing of innocent civilians, in particular women and children. We believe we are the correct country to point apartheid when we see it. And we believe in Israel, that is what is happening, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. And South Africa has a moral duty and obligation to ensure that the Genocide Convention is enforced and it's implemented. But it's also, during the period of COVID, we also led the African countries through the African Union to fight against the hoarding of vaccines by the most developed nations of the world, against and not distributing them fairly, equitable to all countries. And the African continent was the most affected. And through that platform, we were able to find some concessions, even at the WTO level, that will help the African continent with vaccines. And that revolution has now led to also the African continent beginning to build its own capabilities, vaccine manufacturing, huge capability in terms of research in many institutions and universities in our countries, which we believe will help us for the future in relations to pandemics. And recently, you'll be aware, the globe one breaking mpox, and we are also at the receiving end of it, and we are responding to that also as a continent. And we believe that the whole globe has got a role to play to respond equitable to these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. And I want to come back in our conversation to specifically to global public health, these questions of corporate ownership, intellectual property, and all of that. But I want to open up the question. I always feel like it's important before we start any conversation to sort of think about defining our terms, right? And even what we mean. And I will echo the earlier remarks. If you guys have not, the audience has not read the report, I really encourage that you do. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on stage, but I really actually do think that it gives food for thought in trying to reframe how we actually think about how power works in our world. So a quick data points even from here, from the report now. The world's richest 1% own more wealth than 95% of humanity. A shrinking number of firms now dominate key markets across the world, including pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and technology. 60 pharmaceutical companies merged into 10 large corporations between 1995 and 2015. 2 firms control 40% of the global seed market, and nearly 75% of global digital advertising dollars go to just 3 technology companies. And that's just even in a few sectors that we're talking about. So one definition of oligarchy that I found really striking, and this is where I'll bring the panel back in to explain to us how you guys see these terms, is, according to Oxfam's report, oligarchic power ultimately derives from wealth, and thus its concentration is a prerequisite for its exercise. This power is directed toward the defense of that wealth, perpetuating the inequality that enables it. Understood in this way, the movement towards oligarchy is not a problem confined to a handful of states. Democracies are afflicted as the ultra-rich, often through the powerful corporate interests, act on their behalf, can tilt policymaking in their favor at the expense of the majority. Now, Nanjala, I'll start with you. How do you define and how do you think of multilateralism, and how do you think of this question of oligarchy? Particularly, perhaps you've written so much about people power and protests in Kenya. You've also been on the lines of thinking about multilateralism in, I think, the formal way that we think about it through the UN. So how do you think about these terms and these definitions now?
I think, first of all, good afternoon. Okay, where I come from, when someone says good afternoon, you have to say it. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. So one of the experiences that really drilled home the urgency of this issue for me was being in Nairobi during the pandemic and being connected to the world through digital technologies that we all appreciate. But being disconnected from the world through these processes of vaccine discrimination, being unable to travel, having random travel bans being applied. I had to restructure travel plans multiple times because I have a Kenyan passport. And the one conversation that really shook me, I remember we were having a conversation with people who were in the States, and they said, it was a Zoom conversation, they said, oh, thank goodness we've resolved this issue because now we can have vaccines. And I said, that's good for you, but I'm in Kenya and we're being told that there's no vaccines for us. And the hope was always that we would come out of the pandemic smarter as a collective, as a species, that we would come out of it with a keener knowledge of how much cooperation benefits us, and that's something that we needed to prioritize. But the opposite has happened. One of the things that emerged from the pandemic, for example, is that we now have 20 new billionaires that didn't exist before the pandemic. And they became billionaires through the provision of medical supplies. They became billionaires through things that people were depending on to keep them alive. Part of that is the way in which private capital relates to state power, that being able to provide some of these contracts to, in key countries, the allocation of these contracts, the distribution of the proceeds, the privatization of key PPEs were a big one. PPEs made so many people billionaires during the pandemic. And the subsequent interrogation of, well, how were these contracts allocated? Were people in developing countries given a fair shot at being able to provide even within their own economies? Or was there some kind of compulsion between who gets to provide medicine, who gets to allocate, who gets to participate in the supply chain? So for me, that was one of the experiences, just looking at the pandemic and looking at the subsequent, and then now that we're living in this state of denial denial, as if we're pretending that anything that happened between 2020 and 2022 just didn't happen, and there's been some kind of esoteric reset, and we've just moved on, even though the COVID-19 is still very much with us. Really drove home, for me, that experience, the connection between private capital, international relations, state power. That our state structures have become so vulnerable to the influence of private capital through this idea that somehow wealth is a moral and intellectual value, that if you have money, you are smart enough to tell other governments, this is how you should run your seed banks. This is how you should run your school systems. This is how you should run your, forget experts, forget research, forget experience, that we are allowing wealth to function as a moral value at the international stage, and that impact is pervasive. And I bring this back to the question of multilateralism. How I've been involved in a lot of conversations about global tech policy, and what I'm about to say might probably get me disinvited to a lot of conversations, but it's something that stands out to me. How is tech policy made? Is it a conversation between academic experts, between people who are on the ground, between people who work on these issues, or is it a conversation between private capital and state power? In this particular moment in New York, these conversations are happening in meetings similar as this. Declarations will come out, conventions will come out, and treaties will come out. And the people who will be impacted by those decisions will not be represented. It will be a bilateral conversation between private capital and state power. And state power being susceptible to the influence of private capital because of this belief that wealth is a normative value. So that's the fundamental reset that I see that the last 20 years have really exacerbated. And this is what makes us particularly vulnerable, especially on the inequality question, because we no longer listen to people who don't have wealth. We no longer listen to people who are most abstracted from power. Our ears are attuned to the demands of wealth, and that is how multilateralism then becomes shaped by the priorities of those who have wealth.
Yeah. She said the things. This is what we're here for. I like it. We'll continue. Amitabh, to you, and even when we were in the green room, we were discussing this. Because again, a lot of the things that we are talking about and speaking out aren't necessarily new, but perhaps the articulation and the framing, even the use of the word oligarchy itself, can make people feel a little uncomfortable and shift in their seats a little bit. Oxfam is making very boldly the case that oligarchy exists, is a powerful force, but that it is undermining multilateralism. So from both, I think that your perspective as a leader of a global organization that is looking to also empower civil society, I mean, what does this mean to really put in such stark terms? Oligarchy is setting us all back. And you can take that however you would like.
Sure.
Sure.
Thank you. And let me add my voice to the previous two voices. Do read the report. And I'm not saying this because I am Oxfam. It is a powerful report.
It is good.
So please have a look at the report fairly soon. I'm going to, build on the initial statistics that you talked of. I think it's important to bring it back to the room, to make it live in this room. I'm going to request all of us to really take a pause. Just imagine what we are saying. 1% owns more wealth than 95%. We are talking of 3,000 billionaires, primarily men, primarily from the north, and they have added $3 trillion to their kitty in the last 3 years. In these last 3 years, the top 5 billionaires have doubled their wealth, and 5 billion people, that's 60% of the global population, has become poorer. Hunger is back. That's the context that we are in. I think it's really important to talk about it. And Oxfam in our annual inequality report predicts that within a decade, we'll have a trillionaire. In this room, I'm sure many of you would predict who that person is. But that's that's the context we are in. And I really want to applaud my colleagues who have taken this decisive shift of moving from just looking at billionaire wealth to oligarchies. Because the point that you're making is fundamental. We are now talking about billionaires sometimes is seen as apolitical accumulation of wealth. Oligarchy is all about accumulation of wealth and accumulation of power. So that's really the big story. And as you were saying, I think, when you talk of oligarchs, very often, I'm sure James Bond is a name all of us know. The James Bond villain is the oligarch in some rogue nation. But let's be honest, we are not talking about some rogue nation. We are talking about our own realities. And that's what makes us uncomfortable. And that's something that we need to deeply, deeply confront. What is oligarchy doing? You're essentially looking at public policy largely dictated by these few oligarchs. What it does to democracies, you're seeing deep, deep erosion of democracies. What you're seeing is authoritarian regimes coming in, which are essentially there to defend private capital. And then it's an excess that these authoritarian regimes then use populist measures, authoritarian policies to ensure their control over public narratives. And that public narrative we are seeing, whether it's the social media or even the ownership of the media. And I can tell you in India, we have like huge number of channels, TV channels, say around 400, of which almost 300, 75% are owned by 2 billionaires, literally. So who's giving them information to the public? So that's really the fundamental question. So coming to multilateralism, I would urge at least the group here to not get caught in the framing of multilateralism failing because of the US-China equation. That's one part. It is about oligarchs. It is about oligarchs ensuring, in a way, what you said, that when you have COVID, you see vaccine apartheid. Why? Because some pharma giants, who now we call them even vaccine billionaires, are the ones who are profiting from it. They don't let a simple TRIPS measure to be diluted even for COVID vaccines. And we could have saved 1.3 million lives if we had done that. So that's where we are. It's a deeper fundamental question. It's right here at our doorstep. Let's engage with it if we want to defend our democracies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to weave that contribution back to this question of South Africa's experience, Minister Lamona. I mean, specifically on the fight for a more equitable distribution of vaccines. And Amitabh, it struck me when we're calling oligarchy a form of authoritarianism, an authoritarianism that is so strong that it is able to hamstring a country like South Africa from being able to take the lead on providing life-saving, not only vaccines, but as a writer, I was following these debates, also in sharing knowledge with the global North. Right. So is there anything you can tell us, even from your experience in your position, again, when these forces are able to influence and create global trade rules, knowledge sharing rules, prevention of manufacturing? I mean, what is the lesson, I think, you took from some of those battles over the COVID-19 vaccine? And I don't believe that this will be just confined to just public health. This is also other solutions, perhaps even for climate, for food insecurity. So are there any lessons from that fight to manufacture and gain access to vaccines that you maybe are predicting, that you can share and predicting for other sectors?
Yes, we think so. And that's why you will know we also advocated for the vaccine treaty that must then call for the equitable, not only distribution, but also sharing of the IP or the knowledge, but also value add in the countries most affected in the global south, and Africa in particular, where there will be some research and so forth through various universities, but through institutes, and also in the space of research for these pandemics and communicable diseases. But it's not, as you have said, confined only to this sector. It just depends on your geographic location. The global south, climate change, we are the most affected in the global south. Also, sub-Saharan Africa, as we speak now, its work is devastating. Southern Africa is currently suffering the El Nino effects, and many parts of the continent. And one of the key drivers that must enable us to respond to this is the financing for climate change. So we have to be able to advocate as people of the world that we should have more money financing climate change than money financing wars, for example. When you look at the other countries' budget for war, it's astronomical. But we are struggling just to finance these issues of just transition. And it is against that background that as we host the G20, we will put in the agenda family the implementation of the Pact of the Future that we believe it's groundbreaking by that has just been adopted by the General Assembly, which was put forward by the UN Secretary General. We think the Pact of the Future is a very good foundation through which we can build, because it does speak about the transformation of the global financial architecture, financing for climate change, governance of artificial intelligence. It does cover a number of areas which, if people of the world comes together, we can be able to find a platform to action the transformation that we want. And that is what we intend to do as we host the G20.
Thank you so much. We'll be looking forward to that. And this is a general question to the floor. I also duly note, and I will love to come back to the question, yes, of media and these issues. As someone who works for a media corporation owned by a billionaire. Full stop. I mean, look, it's all encompassing, right? It's almost, like all of us in this system, it is the water that we're swimming in, and it's rare, and it's good when we are able to honestly talk about that. From a global sort of narrative and media perspective, how are the narratives about how power and oligarchy function either failing or are exacerbating the problem? I think all too often we have whether it's local media, whether it's international media, and I know when we talk about media, we could also say social media as well. We've seen it both amplify people power, whether it's the Arab Spring, whether it's movements, Black Lives Matter movements in the US, protests in Kenya, but we can also see instances where media has served the interests of power, including of oligarchy, including ownership, including advertising. So this is just a general question of how does media and narrative and storytelling either help or hurt these efforts to even say what the problem is? Angela, I can tell you're already biting at the bit.
My stuff. I think that's such an important question, because I go back to this idea of wealth as a moral value. And if you talk to young people today about their aspirations, it's always terrifying how many people's aspirations have been reduced to wealth. I think there's a shift that has happened. I will use a term that I don't like, which is Gen Z. But I will use the term because I think there's a shift that's happened in the last 20 years that I find very scary. And I always wonder, well, how did the aspirations of young people get captured so easily? part of it is this meta structure in which we live in. What are the who is lionized in our media? Whose stories are told as if they are interesting and important? Who gets a seat at the table? It is easier for an oligarch, for a billionaire, to get invited to have a seat at the table at the United Nations than it is for an expert in a specific issue. That's just the world that we live in right now. It is easier for a task force on artificial intelligence to be comprised of 12 of the biggest companies that make artificial intelligence than it is for it to be made up of 12 of the leading professors of artificial intelligence, or people who even work in that. That is not a fact that is grabbed from the universe. That is exactly what happens in the United States. So there is a contextual shift that has happened in the way in which values are articulated in the public sphere. And part of it, I think, to me, is this capture of what people think is important. And it's reflected in the media narrative as well, and it is reflected subsequently in the priorities that people set for themselves. One of the things that comes from working with digital technologies for me is just this deeper appreciation of this idea of the public sphere. This idea of information just being part of the democratic ecosystem. And we take it for granted. We just assume that there will be some kind of backstop. And I find increasingly that this is such a generational thing. Those of us who grew up reading print newspapers, watching television at prime time, we assume that there is always going to be some kind of backstop. There's an editor somewhere. There's a fact checker somewhere. Someone out there is making sure that this story is true and correct. And in this day and age, that's just not an assumption that holds true. And that's how our narratives get captured. Because the stories that we tell ourselves, or the stories that are allowed to be told about ourselves, are stories that reflect things that we wouldn't necessarily want to be prioritized. We would want to be, we wouldn't want that to be where the attention lies. We wouldn't want that to be the story of our societies. You go back to how oligarchy is sort of captured with state power. One of the things, again, coming out of working with tech and of artificial intelligence that stood out to me is this cognitive separation between the environmental impact of artificial intelligence and the trivial, frivolous uses that are being promoted as the business case for AI. Is it worth every single query? There's cameras here. Every single query that goes into ChatGPT consumes the equivalent of half a liter of water. Mm-hmm. So every time you go to ChatGPT and say, ChatGPT, please write me an exercise program, that's half a liter of water that's gone down the drain. Why isn't this part of the calculus that we think about when we say this is the technology that we're going to be championing? Why is the story of AI suddenly everywhere, even within the civic society space, that this is the future? And this is where we need to go.
You said that it's inevitable.
That is inevitable.
There's nothing we can do about AI.
Exactly. Where does this narrative of inevitability come from, and who does it serve, and who benefits from it? All of this to me loops back to, you said narrative and storytelling. There is a way in which our viewpoints are shaped by centralized narratives, inevitability, of lack of consequence, of detaching the natural environment from the built environment, that I think is creating opportunities that we have to be very careful about. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to pay attention to, I love narrative and storytelling, partly journalism, but partly because maybe a lot of what we do as actors is influenced by our belief about what is. And belief really comes down to the stories that we tell ourselves about the world.
Yeah, Amitabh, and to you, Amitabh, also, chime in, but I'm also thinking, again, about the thing about oligarchy is this sense of there's nothing we can do about this system. We can at least protest to maybe bring down a government leader or a president, or to get laws changed. How do you, if you're in Kenya, how do you protest a CEO who's sitting in New York City? And to that end, yes, I would be curious to see what you think about where's the sort of the people power solution in any and all of this.
But if you allow me, I'll just chime in on this as well.
The floor is yours.
So you talked of the normative value of wealth. I just want to go back to my teenage years. And one of the first acts of international solidarity I did, I was growing up in a small town in India called Bhopal. Many of you would know it for the disaster. But I was in middle school, and I did write a letter asking for Mandela's release. And that was, that was the proudest day for me then. But that's what we were doing in Bhopal. Really a small town then. How has this normative worldview changed? Where internationalism, solidarity, justice, equity were the defining ideas. I think there's been a concerted attempt of 100 years to create there is no alternative to the neoliberal economic order. I think that's something that I just wanted to underscore.
There's nothing worth fighting for.
There's absolutely no alternative is what we have kind of created. And that hegemony, media plays a very, very important role in that, in building that hegemony. Academia plays a role, literature plays a role, but media also plays a significant role. And that's like one of the fundamental battles. How do you puncture this hegemony of there's no alternative, which started with the Washington Consensus, but it's all pervasive. We need to fundamentally challenge that. But coming to your point, as in on people's mobilization, what I still see bright spots. And the bright spots, despite these media narratives, this hegemony, just in the last 2-3 months, see what's happened in Kenya. Young people challenging a regime. Bangladesh. Bangladesh, you have young people coming together and actually changing a regime. That's the power of people. They were not organized. I would actually say that we are behind the curve. The organized civil society is not there. And very often what happens is that once the regime change, the policy change happens, we need to be there as organized civil society. That's the call for all of us, to be able to fill that vacuum. Otherwise, we have seen how these powerful people's movement have led to change, but then it's actually gone to a worse condition than what it was. So that's something I would really, in our theories of change, coming to your point, we need to, as Oxfam, I do take pride that we are a global network. We work in 80 countries. I think that's the power. We are able to link from the local to the global. As in, we must always be humble, but we are able to do that linkage. But that linkage is critical. We are able to use knowledge power with these reports, but I do think the next step is to actually delegitimize this hegemony of this new economic order and also work with people's power, because people's power is what authoritarian dictators worry about oligarchies. But let me just end with one more thing, and to applaud South Africa. I think it's both on Gaza, what you've done is remarkable. Your positions on G20, taxation, on inequality. So you have at the moment, those are the positive sides. That at the G20, you now have the finance ministers agreeing that taxing the super rich is important. Mm-hmm. I hope that the leaders, when they meet again in November, they sign that. Mm. But hopefully in G20 in South Africa, that pact is finalized. So there are those possibilities where we need to really now jump in, but with this understanding that it's about oligarchy. It is not just some minor tinkering. It's a fundamental reform of the structures.
Minister Lamola, would you like to respond to that? And we didn't really get to it in this discussion, but we can get to it in audience questions. But yes, this question of taxes and the global tax scheme and oligarchy basically rewriting trade rules, again, in order to benefit them. So I don't know if you want to be able to respond to the praise and to the question of taxation.
it's heartwarming to hear such praise. We do a thankless job, so.
There are many of us deeply appreciative of what
Thank you. So firstly, in South Africa, what has been called for by the World Health Organization is universal health care. For many years, we have been directed to do that. We had to undergo deep research to look into how can we achieve universal health coverage in South Africa. As you have alluded in your reports, many of them, we are one of the most unequal societies in the world. So that runs deep into all sectors of the South African social life, including healthcare, which we fund public healthcare, but we also subsidize heavily the private healthcare. So we have now put a bill forward, which we call NHI, but it's universal healthcare as per the World Health Organization's standards. We have been drowned as government as reckless. We don't know what we are doing. And it's a huge narrative in the country because obviously those that are benefiting from the healthcare industry wants to preserve the status quo. But we ask ourselves, where are obviously those that we intend to benefit in responding and shaping the narrative that this is the necessary way to go to shape public health care in South Africa, but also in the whole globe, taking forward and ensuring that this bill or this law does indeed get implemented. For me, that is the first thing. The second thing with regards to Gaza, we were also vilified when we went to the International Court of Justice as this reckless, useless country that has got no evidence. We are just on a frolic of excitement, judicial excitement, to go to this court. But the court has ruled 4 times in favor of South Africa. And gradually, the international community is beginning to shift focus, and the narrative has shifted a bit. And we want to thank the public across the globe, particularly the youth that have also taken to the various universities here and many parts of the world to give us this strength to go on, because the narrative can drown you and you may, when you go sleep, sometimes question, is this really the right thing? When you wake up, you are told you are really useless, and you go to sleep, but when you see young people, you see the people of the world, you see professors, you see intellectuals, you see NGOs, civil society saying the world must act in unison to defend the interests of the people of Palestine for their own sovereignty, you then realize that indeed the collective conscience of the global community is reawakening. And it is indeed, we will definitely deal with issues, take from the momentum of Brazil on the financing, the tax issues, and the various issues that will come through for our G20 presidents. We think Brazil are doing a brilliant job that we will carry the momentum forward from. Thank you.
Amazing. One more sort of question, and then I'll open it up to questions for the audience. Obviously, we are sitting here on the sidelines in the hegemon, on the sidelines of the UN. What message or responsibility is there on the people who live in the global north, as I jokingly but not jokingly say, the imperial core, to advocate and push on these issues of oligarchy, of multilateralism? Particularly, I will say, the issue of Gaza. There are a lot of us who maybe studied right here at the UN, at places like international affairs schools, who were taught that international law, that respect for human rights, and Njala's laughing, but I'm serious, that we're supposed to undergird and protect the rights specifically of minorities, of the global minority. And we've been seeing how the United States in particular has run roughshod over many of those rules whether it's at the international humanitarian rights level or at the corporate global oligarchy level. So for those of us who are in the imperial core, What do we do? What can we do? What should we do? And what aren't we doing?
I'll say two things. One is to resist the narratives of inevitability. And I think that has something that has to happen at an individual level. Like the minister said, sometimes when you are a lone voice, you start to feel like a crazy person. Like, am I seeing something that is not there? Am I seeing ghosts? And I think having that internal moral clarity is really important. And I think resisting those narratives of inevitability is part of it. I think we have to continue, on a practical note, we have to continue to uplift narratives that reinforce the kind of world that we want to live in. And I wanted to say this sort of in relation to, this is going to sound like a Praise South Africa Day, but one of the things that I ended up doing during the pandemic was watching a lot of hearings and testimonies. And I remember when, it wasn't President Ramaphosa, it was, Donald Kaberuka was testifying at the State Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, State Foreign Affairs Committee, and he said something that has really shaped my perspective on what multilateralism could be. And he said, in January 2020, 0 African countries had the capacity to test for COVID. By the end of March 2020, every single African country had the capacity to test for COVID. It had nothing to do with the global north. It had nothing, in fact, those countries were an obstacle to realizing that goal. It was multilateral collaboration between African countries, between leadership of African countries and organizations like the Africa CDC, which, yes, complicated, but still, and sort of finding that internal capacity to let the experts on the continent work, the people who every day get malaria medicine across rivers, through the desert, to every single village, letting them do their work. That is what made some of these gains possible. And I always come back to that example because I like to remind African leaders who can sometimes be intransigent on these issues that a different way is possible, that different priorities are possible. But I think that's also an important message for us who are, like you're saying, people who are operating within different centers of power, that there is one version of multilateralism, which is one in which powerful states impose their vision of the world that is predicated on excessive overconsumption, oppression, violence towards the natural environment, conflict, and all of these things. That is one version of the world, and it is unfortunately the version of the world that is with us. But a different way is possible, and those examples are out there, and those of us who know them, I think, have an obligation to amplify them.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Thank you. Let me start by saying, I'm going to talk of 2 or 3 things that could be done. But first, let me start by saying that I feel uncomfortable with the term global majorities.
Okay.
I do think that substituting global south for global majorities takes away the politics of the global south and the global north. These are not geographies. This is a political entity.
Yeah, true.
Let's be clear. So yes, there can be a global south in the north as well. A global north in the south as well. But these are political entities which speak to the centuries of slave trade, colonialism, imperialism. So neo-imperialism. So let's keep that intact, because global majority kind of, everybody's in it. That's not how I see it, because the politics is central. Ultimately, it's about power. But having said this, I think what can be done, I clearly see multilateralism now, particularly in the north, where citizens group, communities, civil society, people need to come together on an ethical, moral compact. And that's what the UN is. If you just read the UN Charter, I keep talking of it as in I still get goosebumps when I read the UDHR. Read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That has enough guidance for what that broad alliance, the Rainbow Alliance, could actually be. And that's what we need to work on, to ensure that the northern entities are not complicit in this unilateralism that we see, and really become part of a global multilateral compact which is fundamentally challenging oligarchies, concentration of power, concentration of wealth. So that's something that we'll need to do.
Fantastic. All right, on that note, it means, you know what this means? That everyone has 2 pieces of homework. So to read Oxfam's report and to read, again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a roadmap. On that note, I will open the floor to submissions. I am agnostic about questions versus comments, but I am tough on length. So to keep them short and sweet, I'll ask you, the gentleman in the purple tie, if you can briefly introduce yourself. Do we have mics? Oh, wait. Mic's coming. Oh, no. You keep, I think you've got another. Do we have another mic? In the interest of time, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I guess 6-7 years ago, we didn't have the conversation on how youth can impact the global process of engaging them in political or in decision-making institutions. And I guess that oligarchies have been always been afraid of you young people.
Okay.
You know? So my question to you is, what are you doing in your own personal, because we're talking about institutions and all the stuff, but we forget that we have a personal space where we make decisions part of our social identity. So what are you doing as leaders to engage young people in this multilateralism movement that is existing right now at the UN?
Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe, yeah. All right. So maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then the panel can kind of go. I see this hand. And if you can identify yourself, I'll see this question. All right, I can give you my mic. That's fine. Is there a runner? Oh, okay. All right, so. Sorry, go ahead. And if you can identify yourself.
Oh, yeah. Bill Hartung from the Quincy Institute. Well, you talked about the importance of narrative. It was also mentioned that a lot of Gen Z folks focus on accumulating wealth rather than larger issues. And I think to break that, you need stories of people who made change, who took risks, who made change. First and foremost, I cut my teeth in the anti-apartheid movement. But there's examples like that all over the world. And I think people need to capture that, because unless you think you can make a difference, you'll just go with the system, And so I guess my question is, how do we get these kinds of ideas well connected with folks who are really going to make the change? It's not going to be panels in New York. It's going to be people on the ground. What do we have to offer them?
Yeah.
I mean, do they need us? And how do we connect?
Take one more question, and then we can. So youth, and then.
Thank you very much. Luis Vieira with the Bretton Woods Project based in London. I have one very quick comment, just to say that I find it interesting that no one mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union as a barrier in social dynamics and political labor dynamics in the West, in Europe and North America. So just throwing that out there. Second issue, I have a question for you related to the question about the global South, global majority. Obviously I recognize a global North-South divide in powers, but given the discussion we're having about oligarchy and state capture, what do we do about the presumption that the more equitable division of North-South power and within multilateralism will really benefit the peoples in the global South? Because one can make the argument that the new multilateral system, more equitable, will continue to represent the power of oligarchies and elites in the global South as well. So I wanted to share your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Maybe should the global South just have more billionaires? Then everything will be fine. All right, so let's take. It's a good question. Let's take the panel. You can take any of those questions and in whatever order. So whoever wants to start first. Youth.
I can start.
You go ahead.
I'm going to take that youth question because I'm youth adjacent.
I'm taking that. I'm extracting that term from you.
What are you saying about us?
I wanted to say, I have one point. It's a big question, but I want to focus on one thing, which is we have to fight for our universities. one of the reasons why the anti-apartheid movement, when you think about any social movement, why universities are so important is because you're at a formative time in your life and you have time to think about what you believe. You are not thinking about your kids, you're not thinking about your job, you're not thinking about all of these other things. You actually have a space where you can think about who you are, what you believe, and why. Our universities are disappearing. Universities are becoming captured by all of these imperatives. In my country, they are eliminating entire departments of humanities in public universities. A university without a humanities department is a technical college. It is not a university. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with a technical college, but we need universities as well. We need philosophers, we need sociologists, we need people who to tell us why we should believe certain things and not others, not just people who are good at making money. And so that would be my first response. And that's something that I personally take very seriously, is fighting for universities, working with university students, working with academics, creating opportunities for academics to share their work, creating new ways of thinking about. My favorite research stream that I've worked on in the last years is publishing in Kiswahili, publishing academic work in languages other than English, to make sure that we're having conversations. Thank you. To make sure that we're having conversations about tech governance in languages that people, I think it was Nelson Mandela who said, if you speak to someone in their language, you speak to their heart. So we should be talking about tech governance in Africa, in African languages. We should be talking about, global inequality in African languages, because we want to bring as many people as possible into these conversations. So for me, that would be the big thing that I would say. Let's protect our universities and fight for our universities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think on the last question, South Africa, as you are aware, we place a premium on the UN as the prime multilateral platform that should mitigate all the contradictions from the South to the West. And we see our platform at the G20 to also play that bridge in terms of implementing, in terms of global finance, the architecture of the global finance, the issues related to climate change, and so forth. And that is the role that we play to ensure that it is responsive to the global South. But we also, as you are aware, participate in a platform called BRICS, which we also see as an addition to these tools that we need to balance the equilibrium between the North and the South. And it is in that regard that you will also be aware that there is even a bank which has just financed some of our huge infrastructure programs in South Africa. And this is a platform where we aggregate the resources to enable ourselves to fund the infrastructure that we need. Our biggest rail infrastructure company called Transnet has just been financed by that. But we also see these platforms of multilateralism to enable us to resolve conflicts where we have to play a role. And in the Southern Africa, we are doing so in the eastern part of the DRC. We have just participated in the north of Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, and we are also urging that the African Union should be playing a more leading role in the current conflict in Sudan, with the hope that many African countries will come in to help the situation, because it is currently the biggest catastrophe the world can ever see, and women and young people, in particular children, in any conflict are the most affected. So I think we can also play a role by shining that spotlight on Sudan and calling for measures that will be driven to achieve peace.
Does anyone want to take the Russia question?
But there was the other question. I want to also come back to the question on the North and South. And we've also released a report a week ago. It's called Vetoing Humanity. Have a look at that report as well. As in, at the moment, you have a Security Council which is completely dysfunctional, archaic, essentially a reflection of the colonial past. You take 6 months to even get after vetoes to get a ceasefire resolution approved when the UN General Assembly has done resolutions to that effect. You have the case of Ukraine, where the aggressor itself vetoes the resolution. It's a dysfunctional system at the moment, reflective of the colonial past. And that fundamentally needs to change. The point that I'm making is, and thank you for asking me because I want to be clear, I do think that people in the North can be the greatest ally for a just compact. So there is solidarity to be built across people, as in the anti-apartheid movement. Obviously, it was remarkable what South Africans did. But from all over the world, there were people pouring in their support and solidarity. I think that's the point I want to make, is that let's not take away the colonial history, the history of imperialism, and build a new multilateralism which recognizes this history. The other question, I think you're bang on. I personally agree that ultimately it is about, I would even say that it is not just about having those stories. It is also investing in building those stories. There are lots of people who are doing it, but sometimes I do feel that we end up having our gaze wrong. Our gaze is too often to the UN. That's not where the gaze has to be. It has to be with people. Those change makers, those people who are fundamentally challenging power, just challenging patriarchy in their families. That's an act of courage. And how do you build on those acts of courage is critical. That's again a task that we all need to work on, and not have these quick fix solutions that you do a good report. We love doing good reports. But you do a good report and you think that narratives are going to change.
That's my job, our job. A panel for another day. On that note, we will have to close this one. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you to my guests. And I will hand it off to Sally Booker to close us out. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. Can we have another round of applause for this exceptional panel? On behalf of the Ford Foundation, I want to thank you all for coming here. And I just want to leave you with one thought. You know the acronym for what the oligarchs want you to believe. There is no alternative. The acronym is TINA. You know what the alternative to that is? It's tapas. There are plenty of alternatives. So if you look at a menu and you see TINA or tapas, I mean, what are you going to choose? You're going to choose the tapas. So everyone go out and have some tapas and help us build the plenty of alternatives that we need to combat this oligarchy. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.